ghost towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barlee, who is our tour guide for British Columbia, northern Washington State, the Yukon, Alberta. Heaven knows where it will go. Usually we talk about the grizzled prospector, but today we talk about another grizzled veteran, I guess, of pioneer days, but
right.
A different stripe of man. Who are we talking about today?
We're talking about a banker, Mike.
Oh, that could be like paint drying.
Yeah. Well, no, it isn't. It really isn't. What it is, it's a story of theft, murder, intrigue, treachery, seduction. Really has everything.
With bankers in B.C.
Yep.
All right. Take a break here. Be back in a second and meet these seductive, treacherous, larcenous bankers and their henchmen right after these words. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee and larcenous, seductive bankers. I would never have had that feeling. Where are we talking about? Where do these bankers hang out?
We're talking about the old line banks in British Columbia, Mike. And when you look at the old-time banks of this province in the early days before, we'll say 1870, you come across a number of names. The Merchants Bank of Halifax, the Eastern Townships Bank, the Bank of British North America, the First Bank of British Columbia. And finally, you talk about MacDonald's Bank. Now, MacDonald's Bank is not well known, but this is really the focus of our story. And it's really quite fascinating because what you're really examining is early Victoria. And early Victoria in 1858, 1859, 1860 was one of the most fascinating towns on the Pacific Slope. There's no doubt about it because the Fraser River rush was underway. Miners were drifting up past old Fort Langley, and they were going up into Fort Hope, and then up into Yale, and up into Lytton, and up into Lillooet, and heading for the Caribou. And the interesting thing was, right on their heels come two great American giant express companies, Adams and Company and the famous Wells Fargo. And when we talk about Wells Fargo and Adams to a lesser extent, because they're not as well known, we talk about a very magnificent company, a company that was ethical to the nth degree. They had started in California in 1852, Mike, and in that 6 years, they had established a reputation probably second to none amongst banking companies and express companies. Because what Wells Fargo said was law. That was an absolute word. They guaranteed shipments. They delivered on time. Their discourse with the various individuals that dealt with them was always word of mouth, and it was honored always honored. So that Wells Fargo really established a long-term relationship with the mining fraternity. They trusted Wells Fargo. But Wells Fargo was really an intermediary. They got gold from various express companies from the interior of British Columbia and went down to Victoria. Then Wells Fargo and Adams and Company, who were their rivals, would ship that gold into San Francisco.
So Wells Fargo was not, they weren't plying the trails between Barkerville and Victoria. That was somebody else. Wells Fargo carried the goods from Victoria to San Francisco.
That's right. Okay. That's what they would be doing. And now, on the scene appears a very fascinating individual, a young man. He's 28 years old. His name is Alexander D. MacDonald. And he'd been born in Inverness, Scotland, and at probably late teens or early 20s, as near as we can tell, he travels to New Orleans, where his uncle owns a bank. And he learns the banking business. Then he hears about the California gold rush. He travels to California in 1855. He stays there in Placer County for several years, does quite well, marries a young woman, wife, and she comes north. They hear about the Fraser River. They drift north with the rush, thinking there's opportunity in the British dominions. And indeed there is, because he arrives in early Victoria, and Wells Fargo's there, and Adams and Company is there, but there's no bank as such. So he thinks he'll be an intermediary with Wells Fargo, tries Wells Fargo, they don't accept it, but Adams and Company does. He then makes a trip into the interior to see how rich the gold is. He goes up to the Bridge River country, comes back with 50 ounces of very coarse nuggety gold. That's a little over 4 pounds troy, Mike. So he comes back with that gold. He is really convinced that this is going to be probably as famous as California.
No, he goes up there and he actually buys
Sure he
4
does.
pounds Troy gold.
Yeah.
So he had finances himself. He goes up there, gets the gold, and comes back.
Yeah, well, he spends 50 ounces times $16 an ounce, we'll say there, $800, which is a fair amount in those days, and that's just to convince himself. Then he goes right ahead. He builds a bank right in Victoria, right on, I think it was Government Street in Victoria, and it is called MacDonald's Bank.
Quite an edifice.
He names it after himself.
Well, wise.
Sure. And he has an arrangement now with Adams and Company, and he's a bit of a social lion. He's very likable, he's articulate, he's honest, people are attracted to him, and he does very well in the city of Victoria, and he and his wife are accepted by all the socialites in Victoria, and for the first 6 months he does quite well, but there's a little bit of a cloud on the horizon, and what happens is this, is that Wells Fargo moves in on Adams and Company, and they buy them out. So he hasn't got that connection. And then about 5 months after he established his bank, because he established his bank in the spring of 1859, who comes onto the scene but the Bank of British North America. Now, the Bank of British North America is really an English firm. Old, established bank, great deal of money behind it. And the interesting thing is, they not only come into Victoria, and they're cutting into some of his ground, but they don't touch the actual transport of gold. They're not interested in that. But they do put out banknotes. So they have banknotes, Bank of British North America, and people up to that time, Mike, like, you know, they didn't accept banknotes. Here's a banknote, and that's the Bank of Brantford. And that banknote is from an extent, you know, the bank is defunct. It's gone. And
it's only got printing on one side.
Quite often, that's the early banks. They only had printing on one side, and people were very suspect of the early bills, Mike. So that he knows he's in a bit of trouble because the Bank of British North America is issuing bills, and they're cutting into a little bit of his business. But he's still doing very well. He's doing so well, he builds a mansion on Michigan Street, which he calls Springfield. And this is really quite a magnificent structure, and stood there for years, in fact. And so he continues on 1858, 1859, 1860, 1861, 1862. And he's a fair competitor for Wells Fargo. And he ships out $1.5 million of bullion. And his rate probably, and we're guessing a little bit, usually was 3 to 5%, but a little higher in British Columbia. So it was probably at least 5%. But not only that, he's carrying other things. He sells holsters, he sells guns, he sells liquor.
This is out of his bank?
Right out of his bank. This is a real frontier bank, okay? So he's selling all sorts of other things in his bank to bring in a little extra income. Centers of profit, they'd call it today. Yeah. But he's sharp. People like him. They're attracted to his bank. And another thing happens. 1862, who comes on the scene but another bank? This is the first Bank of British Columbia. Now, the interesting thing about this bank, it's chartered in England, but they arrive in Victoria, and they're ready to go head-on-head with Alexander D. MacDonald.
The Bank of British North America was no problem because it wasn't going head-to-head. But now the Bank of British Columbia, the first Bank of British Columbia, does.
They want to cut themselves into the gold field trade. And that gold is flowing steadily in from the Caribou in 1862. So very early in 1863, the Bank of British Columbia comes out with some notes. $5 note, banknote, $10 banknote, $20 banknote, $50 banknote, $100 banknote. Then they decide that $100 is too big. You get rid of it, withdraw it from circulation, and put in a $1 banknote. Now he has the Bank of British North America notes. He has the Bank of British Columbia notes. Alexander MacDonald says, gosh, I'm in a bit of a problem here. Maybe I better put out my own notes. So he does. He comes out with a note, and this is it.
Oh, it's so, I mean, this is obviously a rare commodity.
Yeah, there are several hundred in existence, that's all now. He put out thousands, Mike, and so he put them out on a Sunday, and that's interesting, and you can read the date right on it.
Look at that. It says September the 6th, 1863,
that's
written in pen.
Yes.
And his signature is in pen at the bottom. So he signed every bill himself.
And probably Thompson or Smith is on that other.
I think that Thompson's
there.
Side.
Yeah. So and what they did is they brought them out on a Sunday because they weren't busy at Sunday in the bank, and they didn't want to sign these notes in front of people because people were a little jumpy about banknotes, actually. So they had several thousand banknotes, and things are doing fairly well until the manager of the Bank of British Columbia he looks at these notes, they're presented to his bank, and he says these are unsecured. In other words, Alexander MacDonald's bank has not been actually chartered. And if he isn't chartered, then they're an unsecured note. You're only trusting Alexander MacDonald. So he writes to the colonial authorities, stating that this is a very poor precedent. This bank is putting out notes, and they're not a chartered bank, and he thinks something should be done about it. And sure enough, he puts on enough pressure so that something is done about it. Two laws are passed, the Banknote Act and the Banking Act, in 1864. And this puts Alexander MacDonald in a very precarious position, because what it says is that as of early 1865, that would be the next year, he must cease printing his own banknotes unless he becomes a chartered company. Now, this is kind of catch-22, because he can't become a chartered company in that quick order. It will probably take several years, and the Bank of British Columbia knows this. But he continues on his course. He has 5 individuals working for him, a young clerk called Josiah Barnett, and a very strange Canadian called John Waddell, and another guy called Spencer Thompson, and another man called Cocker, who is his manager really in the Richfield area. He now has a bank in Victoria and another branch in Richfield. And
in the heart of the gold
country. That's right. William
Cocker
Cocker's a very, very interesting guy, and evidently he owes Alexander MacDonald $15,000. So what I assume happened was this, is that Cocker took in the gold from various individuals on Williams Creek and Lightning Creek and all those magnificent creeks of the Caribou, gave them MacDonald's notes in exchange, but the gold disappeared somewhere. He ends up owing MacDonald $15,000. And there's another man called Robert T. Smith, who's another gold buyer for MacDonald. So MacDonald makes a trip into the Caribou in the fall of 1864, stopping on the Fraser River and all those little camps all the way up, then going right into the heart of the Caribou, right into the heart of the gold fields, and he starts picking up gold. And what happens is this. He's there in September. And in his bank, everything is going on apace.
He's left people in charge of
That's
Victoria.
right. He has left enigmatic John Waddell in charge. And with him are Smith and Barnett. And they go through a certain ritual, a certain routine. If they have a lot of cash, they take that cash to the Bank of British North America, whom they have a good working relationship with. Well, now they amass a considerable amount of gold coin, $15,000 in English sovereigns. And here's a half sovereign here, Mike.
Is this that one right there?
No, that's the American one. There's a half sovereign. And there's the difference between an American coin and an English coin.
So the bank, MacDonald's Bank in Victoria, while MacDonald's up in Richfield, is taking care of business, and they've amassed a fair amount of gold, 15,000 in gold.
Now, they've amassed much more than that.
Yeah.
And when you're talking thousands in the 1860s, you're talking a lot of money. $15,000 in English sovereigns, $10,000 in Bank of British North America notes, which are acceptable at face value anywhere in North America. It's a long-established bank. And about $5,000 in American coin, that's silver and gold, and a few MacDonald's banknotes themselves. So you have about $30,000 sitting there. But as it happened, Waddell and his clerks didn't get the work done. So they couldn't. Ordinarily, they put this right into the Bank of British North America. The Bank of British North America is closed. So the young clerk, Josiah Barnett, who's a very decent guy, a young actor, he's a kind of an amateur actor on the Victoria stage. He goes to close their, and they put these in one safe in the vault, and it's a fireproof vault.
Yeah.
And there are 2 safes in the vault, but one is for the bullion. Ordinarily, not this much. They jam all this gold coin into the safe, and there's kind of a catch that he's supposed to spring, but he's forgotten how to do it. Now, Waddell knows how to do it. He doesn't help him. And the kid admits that he doesn't know. He was taught it once, but he can't remember how to close that safe, which prevents it from being picked. But anyway, he locks the safe, still be picked, because he hasn't got that secure bolt through.
Yeah.
And he gives the key to Waddell.
Yeah.
And Waddell puts it in a drawer. And this young clerk notices this, and he says, "Oh, Mr. Waddell," he said, I think you should take that with you, because they could just go up and open the safe if somebody ever broke in. Oh, Waddell says, okay, and finally puts it in his pocket. And then he and Waddell and Smith all leave the bank at the same time, lock the door behind them. $30,000 in the safe. Next morning, the caretaker, who's trusted, opens the safe, opens the bank door, walks in, the vault is wide open. One safe is wide open. Not the one that was relatively valueless, but the one with the gold coin is empty. He looks around. There's a ladder coming down from a skylight, 8-foot ladder.
Yeah.
Skylight's open. Evidently, she sees a bar on the floor, and 2 rough keys, one of which fits the lock perfectly. One of which, so somebody had a copy, where it was able to make a copy of the original key. Now, why did they leave the keys behind? Very interesting. And they also noticed that the skylight had to be opened from the inside, so that obviously somebody had come through the front door with a key. But the police are very slow. They fail to search any ships going out of the harbor, and they don't really get on it at all. And they question young Josiah Barnett, who is really guiltless. Everyone knows this. The kid doesn't really understand what banking is all about. And they throw a few questions at Smith and a few at John
Waddell?
Waddell, yeah. But they say no, they had nothing to do with it, and so on. The word spreads quickly into the Caribou, Mike, and it flashes from camp to camp that $30,000 in gold has disappeared out of the safes of MacDonald and Company in Victoria. And this is disastrous. So immediately, all the miners from all the creeks in the Caribou come in and they extend their notes to Alexander MacDonald. He meets $40,000. There's $63,000 he's given in notes. He meets $43,000 of it. He takes the other $23,000 with him, saying he'll make good. And so he pays out all this. His bank is now teetering on oblivion.
Yeah.
He goes back to Victoria. Another $18,000 in notes are presented to him there. He meets that. But it's very, very difficult, extremely difficult for him, because now everyone knows that he's on very rocky ground. And this is and the actual robbery took place on September 22nd, 1864. For 3 valiant months, this guy does his utmost to stem the tide against MacDonald's bank. And finally, he realizes he can't do it. He may go to debtor's prison. So his wife has left for California sometime prior to that, and late one night, he is rowed out to the Sierra Nevada, an American ship, heading for San Francisco, and he boards the ship, and he escapes British Columbia. By the way, the individual who took him out there was Waddell. Very, very, very generous of Waddell. He rows the owner out to the ship. The owner disappears. And what happens is, of course, is that he goes back into the States, tries to get more money to resurrect his bank, is not able to do so. There's a bit of a depression even in the States and in Canada at that time. So he drifts on to other professions. He gets a job at Alameda, California. Then he goes into the Black Hills following gold again. Eventually comes back to San Francisco in 1913, and he dies there. So that he'd come into Victoria as a young man, 28 years old, was the lion of society, was a successful businessman, was an attractive personality, had everything going for him until the robbery. And the robbery really finished him. But very interesting, because we follow up on the other individuals who participated at least in some part of the robbery.
Okay. We'll do that when we get back from this break. What happened to Waddell, to Smith, to Cocker, to all of these other characters who are participant with MacDonald in this bank story? Don't go away.
Body and Health, weekday afternoon.
Okay, October of 1864, bank robbery at MacDonald's bank. Really sewers the bank. Looks like an inside job.
Yeah, actually September 22nd, 1864, but there are 3 players we follow up on. And one of these players is Joshua Spencer Thompson, one of the guys who signed the notes. He's one of the gold buyers for MacDonald, originally was. He goes on to later greater fame, actually, becomes the editor of the Caribou Sentinel, designs the original flag of British Columbia, which has now disappeared, and becomes an MP. So he is quite famous. Another guy is kind of interesting, too, a guy called Robert Smith. And Robert Smith is another gold buyer an old gold buyer for MacDonald. He stays in British Columbia for many years, finally moves to Salt Lake City, Utah. And there, and kind of middle-aged man, he's engaged to a young woman, a Miss Davidson, and she has a good background and everything else. She goes to a doctor, he drugs her, and in the term of the day, he violates her. Well, Smith is just outraged. He goes to see the doctor, tells him to get out of town. He gives him 24 hours to get out of town, and as luck would have it, 24 hours later, Smith is walking down past a railroad station. The doctor is coming the other way. The doctor sees Smith. He pulls out his revolver, shoots Smith twice. Smith just falls down. He's mortally wounded. A sheriff sees this Dr. Snedeker. He grabs him and arrests him. Smith is not quite dead. He rises on one elbow, levels his pistol at Snedeker, shoots him through the heart. Snedeker dies as well. Smith dies that night, and Smith, and End of those two, but the most interesting character is a guy called Waddell. This is the Canadian from Ontario. He disappears from Victoria very soon after the robbery. Next we hear of him, he has bought himself a ship. Where did he get the funds? And the ship is called the Explorer. He's actually shipping out of one of these Ontario towns, Windsor, and in 1870, he's shipping whiskey, very valuable, and mill machinery, extremely valuable as well. Insures it for $18,000, and he decides he is going to go to Manitoulin Island. But the ship never makes it. He reports that he and his son, his young son's on board. They come back, and they say the two crewmen had died. Ship had hit a hard storm, and they couldn't handle it. The crewmen went down to stem the water flowing into the hold, and the ship turned turtle on them, and they couldn't rescue the crewmen, and they died in the mishap. He collects $18,000. $18,000.
Big money.
Years pass, he disappears, supposedly in a mishap at sea again. Nobody really knows where he's gone, but the upshot of this story is a captain called Captain H.M. Rex, who owns a ship coincidentally called the Victoria, decides to pick up the whiskey. It's going to be well-aged, 1882. So some years have passed. Yeah. He goes down and examines the ship with divers. He sees 12 big auger holes in the ship. Yeah. So obviously the captain had scuttled the ship. He gets inside the cabin, discovers a body, the skeletal remains of one of the crewmen. So Waddell had not only scuttled his own ship, picked up the $18,000, but killed the two witnesses, kept only his son alive. So we're pretty certain we know who was the mastermind behind the robbery of Alexander MacDonald's bank in Victoria way back in 1864.
So he got away with 30 grand there and sent MacDonald's spiraling down from his social order.
Yeah.
Did not take Thompson down.
Yeah.
Did not take Smith down.
No.
But he himself, this guy's a bad dude. Do you think he might have rigged his own death just to disappear from sight?
I think he did. I think he thought they were following him, and they were tracking him a little bit. And it's rather sad because MacDonald never suspected it.
Never did.
No.
Here's this bank story. This amazing young guy creating his own life at the time, and with a remarkable story to tell.
The treacherous associate.
Whatever happened to Cocker?
Well, Cocker kind of disappears out of the scheme of things. He never did pay back the $15,000 he owed Alexander D. MacDonald, and that had some hand in the eventual dissolution of the bank, of course.
There are many other bank stories to tell, because the arrival of bankers in British Columbia to participate in its development, we're going to tell a whole story about the Bank of BC down the road a little while.
Oh, sure, very colorful bank. The early Bank of BC was really quite magnificent.
All right, we'll do that later. This has been the story of Alexander MacDonald's bank. He printed his own banknotes. He was believed by the prospectors and miners, and he was done in, I guess, by trusting the people that worked for him. Great story. That's all for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns tonight. We'll be back again next time. Join us then. Bye-bye. Happening here in British Columbia?
All happening.